Hello and welcome everyone. Before we get started, I want to let you know that this program is being recorded and will be available on the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum's YouTube channel after this presentation. My name is Natalia Mercedes Rodriguez, and I am the Digital Content and Programs Coordinator at Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. I want to welcome you all to our virtual lecture with composer Jonathan Woody, violinist Shelby Yamin, and historical clarinetist Dominic Giardino, centered on Jonathan Woody's forthcoming work, I Do Promise. Commissioned by Dyckman Farmhouse Museum and the period instrument ensemble Music of the Regiment, I Do Promise blends 21st century sounds with 18th century instruments and texts from the American Revolutionary War. Taking its name from a line in General Henry Clinton's 1779 Philipsburg Proclamation, the work is a musical meditation on the experiences of Africans and Black Americans who navigated Britain's utilitarian policies of emancipation in New York and throughout North America between 1775 and 1783. This project is made possible through the generous support of the New York State Council on the Arts. During the roundtable, if you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A function and we will answer those questions at the end. Without further ado, welcome Jonathan Woody, Shelby Yamin, and Dominic Giardino.
Well, thank you so much, Natalia. I don't want to speak for all of us too soon, but I know we're excited to be here with you tonight, virtually for the Dyckman Farmhouse. And thank you to everyone who's tuning in and joining us for this roundtable. This is a project that's been in the works now for almost 2 years, I want to say. It's been just around 2 years from sort of point of concept to where we are today. And to that end, I want to thank the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum for actually being the motivators originally of this project when we were looking into it in 2024. Shelby and I were taking a walk up Broadway and ended up stopping into the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum and really just fell in love with this bastion of historical preservation that's otherwise lodged in the hustle and bustle of urban uptown Manhattan. And that relationship led to this commissioning project and ultimately the grant that we received from the New York State Council on the Arts. So before we dive in, I think it would be really beneficial maybe for each of us to sort of introduce ourselves and our role in this project. I can quickly start. Natalia gave us a nice little rundown. My name is Dominic Giardino. I'm a historical clarinetist based in Washington Heights, and very, very interested in diving into this local history and its context in the American War for Independence, particularly as we're headed towards America 250. Maybe I'll pass it to Jonathan.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for being here. My name is Jonathan Woody. I live across the East River in Brooklyn, and am a singer and composer based here in New York for the last 15 years. I find that a lot of my work revolves around history, both European history and American history. And I also like to highlight the history of African Americans that's kind of been present throughout all of that time period, particularly in the world of classical music. And I'll turn it over to Shelby.
Hello, thank you all for being here. I'm Shelby. I am a violinist and I specialize in historical performance. And I also live in Washington Heights, very close to the farmhouse. And yeah, I'm just excited for this project and I look forward to speaking about it.
So before we dive into the content of the project itself, or sort of a conversation around what we're working towards, I thought it would be useful actually to start with maybe about 5 minutes or so of just historical context about maybe why we selected this particular subject and why it's locally important, why it's also important for this moment as we approach America 250. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I just have a few slides to get us in. All right. I'm going to trust that we can see these slides. Perfect. So actually, we're starting right here with I Do Promise. As Natalia mentioned, this is a new composition that we're commissioning from Jonathan that will be finished by the end of this year. We're currently working on an opportunity to perform it, but the subject of I Do Promise is really rooted in New York's history with the American War for Independence, and not necessarily in its sort of traditional mainstream public narrative. The American War for Independence or the American Revolution was many things to many people. I mean, I think anybody would associate, say, the phrase "no taxation without representation" with the American Revolution, right? This was, in part, an economic revolution that was going to give people a greater leniency in how they conducted their own personal business. It was also a political revolution, of course. You know, America famously has no king, and this would be the reason why. But most interestingly for us and for this project, it was a real social revolution. Um, and well, the public narrative around the social revolution of the American Revolution is there. It tends to focus on class and society and one's ability to, say, become upwardly mobile. And well, museums and folks in academic circles have been doing amazing work for many, many, many years in, say, the racial history of the American Revolution. It is sort of a shame that it's not a larger part of our remembrance of the American War for Independence, as 30,000 Black Americans and Africans would emancipate themselves as a result of this conflict, and not necessarily emancipating themselves in the name of American liberty, but maybe contrary to what we're thinking, they emancipated themselves under British protections. In fact, in 1775, the essayist Samuel Johnson remarked, and remember, this is 1775, there's a lot of talk about people accepting slavery as being a necessary part of life. I think this quote actually defies a little bit of that. He writes essentially, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps of for liberty from those who are driving slaves? And so at this time, there actually is a bubbling discourse around emancipation, around racial equality would be entirely too far to take it in this period in the context of these folks that we're talking about. But this idea that humans are humans, of course, is becoming core to intellectual circles in Britain. And this has a major inflection point in 1772 with the Somerset case. So if anyone's familiar really with the history of abolition in the British Atlantic world, the Somerset case in 1772, without a doubt, made slavery as an institution illegal in the United Kingdom, in Britain itself. Now, this wasn't something that actually spread throughout the British colonial world, but it was something that became ingrained in the British psyche, that if you're in Britain, if you're amongst Britons, if you're a British person, you are a person, and therefore anybody in Britain cannot be subject to essentially being chattel or property. This way of thinking is going to make its way pretty quickly into the American War of Independence when tensions break out in 1775, not for humanitarian reasons, but for the simple fact that racial tension was an undeniable part of American culture in the 18th century and 17th centuries and 19th centuries and through to today. But in the 18th century, the greatest fear that a white colonist had in Virginia wasn't necessarily that the Spanish and the French were going to come and invade. It was that there would be an insurrection of enslaved peoples in a locality near you. And that's because in a place like Virginia, for instance, nearly 50% of the population were enslaved Black Americans and Africans. So in 1775, Lord Dunmore, who is the royal governor of Virginia, actually issues an edict that gives freedom to, and you'll see underlined here, enslaved peoples who were willing to bear arms for the royal cause. Essentially, Dunmore was attempting to create a slave insurrection, an insurrection of the enslaved, in support of British policy and to put down the American insurrection. Fast forwarding to 1779 is where we come to the Philipsburg Proclamation. And this is where, of course, we take the title of the composition. In the Philipsburg Proclamation, and what makes the Philipsburg Proclamation sort of groundbreaking as a, say, wartime emancipation policy by the British, is if you zoom in, Henry Clinton is actually very specific in a way that Dunmore is not, that any enslaved person who flees to British lines is actually just going to be free. It doesn't matter if they can bear arms. It doesn't matter if they're going to support the military effort. This actually, 1779 in the Philipsburg Proclamation, begins a policy in North America that if you are going to seek British protection as a Black American or an African in these colonies and insurrection, you are going to be essentially granted British citizenship and British protections. And this is a amazing and complicated story that history will actually lead to essentially the settlement of Sierra Leone in the following decades, and settlements in Nova Scotia along the way when loyalists are forced to evacuate in 1783. 60,000 American loyalists are going to evacuate in 1783 when the war is over. And with them are going to be huge amounts of Black Americans who are now looking essentially for a new path forward. But 1779 is, for lack of a better way of saying it, where the story begins from this sort of blanketed emancipation policy. And what makes that complicated, of course, is that it's really a wartime policy. It's a utilitarian policy. It's not something that was done out of a humanitarian interest as much as it was done because this was something that the British felt they could use to motivate a positive outcome for the crown. And so I Do Promise, the piece itself, really comes to us as an opportunity to engage with this history in a way that contextualizes it with the broader story of the American Revolution. Of course, it comes at this moment where we are about to celebrate 250, or celebrate or commemorate, if you will, 250 years of American independence and statehood. And to that end, this last slide with the America 250, I feel what we're coming up against and sort of the moment that we're experiencing is at an intersection of celebration and commemoration, right? We're all going to be making decisions on how we want to engage with America 250. And, one of the things that makes music so powerful is it can engage with subjects that it can engage with a variety of subjects. It can engage with a variety of topics in a way that is really meant to touch audiences on several different planes. So we're hoping to tell this story. We're hoping to impart hopefully an emotional experience. But we're also hoping with I Do Promise to really get people thinking about our history as Americans in a much larger context, a much more inclusive context. A realistic context, I should say. So that's sort of our historical context or background for I Do Promise. I'm going to hit stop share here. And one of the reasons why we really wanted to work with Jonathan on a project like this is something that I know Jonathan has engaged with several different organizations over the last few years, from groups like Apollo's Fire in Cleveland to, I believe, Toffel Music you recently worked with as well in a similar with a similar composition. And so before maybe we dive into some of those works, I thought it would be interesting actually to talk about why one historical performance is relevant to this, um, and and two, sort of what role we think music actually sort of takes in telling this story. So I've used the word historical performance maybe one or two times. I was wondering, Shelby, could you share a little bit about what that means if folks in the room aren't familiar?
Sure. So it's a little bit of a complicated question because I'd say it means something different to all of us who play it. But in the most general sense, it's playing music either on the instruments that are period appropriate. So in this case, instruments from the late 18th century, just the equipment itself, which doesn't apply to vocalists. And I think Jonathan can talk a little bit about that. But the other sense of historical performance is the way we approach music and the way we play it. We adhere to the known parameters and sensibilities that those that we can read about or study. Of course, we don't have recordings and we don't have um, any concrete evidence as to what anything would have sounded like, but that's the fun for us is we research and we dive in and we kind of get the music to sound um, as close as we feel necessary or can to its original intention. And I'm sure you could both add a lot to that, but that's
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, and of course, everything you're saying there is I think a really it's what we would tell our audiences, right? If we're playing music by Corelli, or if we're playing music by Bach, or we're playing music by Mozart, but in this very unique circumstance, increasingly not unique, which is a great thing, we're actually going to be using historical instruments like, we'll see if I can, with my background here, if I can hold this up. Like this is the top of an 18th century clarinet. But we're actually using historical technology to engage with music that's brand new as it could possibly be. Um, and Jonathan, because you have so much experience doing this work, I was wondering if we could get your perspective a little bit on um, of what that experience is like. You know, what the both the maybe the challenges, but also the rewards of working with quote antiquated technology as a modern composer.
Yeah, of course. Well, and maybe to answer that, I'll start with answering a portion of your previous question, which was how do we approach music from these historical time periods as modern day performers, and why, and sort of what's the relevance. And so for me, I think I'm always thinking about the links between the historical events of the time period in question and the music, art, literature, that's created alongside those historical events. I just find the connection between sort of what happens in a historical story in a time period and the artistic output that we get from that. That's always been an interest of mine. And so as a composer, um, I like to look backwards and use, as Dominic and Shelby discussed, the instruments of the day to kind of tell a story that might be appropriate for that day or from that day. So I'll give you some examples of some pieces I've written before. Um, Actually, I have an example of one from right here in New York City as well. The Five Boroughs Music Festival a few years back uh, commissioned song cycles from several composers about the five boroughs of New York. And I got to write a little 3-minute song about my home borough of Brooklyn. And it was a fun research project for me where I discovered that, very similar to the Dyckman House in Upper Manhattan, there's a Lefferts House in Brooklyn, which was once the farmhouse on a large plantation estate there. And that Lefferts House indeed was a house where enslaved people worked to build the wealth and economic power of early Brooklyn in the same way that enslaved people built most of the economic power of colonial America. Um, I was able to find some runaway slave notices that were printed in the New York Gazette, and I set those to music along with letters from the contemporary planters, people whose names we would recognize, names like Stuyvesant, Vanderbilt, Bergen, Remsen. There are writings of theirs that survive that discuss their relationship with their employed or enslaved African Americans over the centuries. And I just thought that juxtaposing those writings with the sounds that we're so familiar with from that time period really starts to connect for people, sort of how real life might have been for people who were alive then. You know, we get a window as 21st century people into their world, quite literally through the instruments and through the sort of styles of music that they would have heard, you know, that they may have created. And so it's just sort of my way of connecting our disparate time periods and trying to show that we're not actually that far apart, in fact.
Yeah, it's something that I really do relate to you on is this idea of taking sort of direct inspiration from the people and the events that inspired the music of the time, right? When we're talking about historical music. And something that you just said that really resonated with me is oftentimes when we're as musicians working on programs like this, or maybe tackling a program or a subject matter that is, you know, not all just shepherdesses on the hills, right? Which is a lot of early music. It's hard to sometimes find music that actually engages with maybe the pathos or like real sort of the depth of the individual experience. And I wonder if sort of in Kings is the piece that you're referencing that you referenced, which would love to hear live at some point. Are there any recordings of In Kings, Jonathan?
Sorry, I don't think that there's a recording, at least not one that I've ever had access
Yeah.
to, unfortunately.
Well, the thing that I wonder is like as a composer working today and dealing with historical subject matter, and forgive me if this is maybe just like a little bit of a armchair kind of question. How do you find yourself actually investigating or relaying the emotional experiences or tapping into the emotional world of people who actually we can never communicate with and we can never really have these answers for?
I mean, you know, part of that is the fun of being a historian, and you know, just consuming as much as I can, primary sources, secondary sources, historical analysis. You get an overarching sense of how people live, and so it does take a little bit of creativity and a little bit of imagining. I liken it to perhaps people who write historical fiction, you know, where they are able to take these very well researched stories, but add the human component of making it about a single person or about their family. So that's the kind of thing I like to think I'm doing. Taking stories that where someone may have heard music in their head that we will never know, and perhaps giving voice to that music.
I love that. I love this idea of Jonathan Woody, author extraordinaire. You're a storyteller, right? I mean, and you are a storyteller, and your music is. We're actually going to take a listen to some of your music now, and I think folks will agree. I mean, this piece that we're going to listen to is so incredibly beautiful and is not an 18th century piece, and yet somehow feels like it belongs to both the 18th century and today, all at the same time. Um, Shelby, this is actually a piece that I know you are involved in the premiere of and the commissioning ensemble. You're a member of the commissioning ensemble. Do you think you could set up this clip that we're going to listen to?
Sure. So it's not based on a historical event. It's based on a myth, the Orpheus myth. And what I think is so relevant to what we're talking about is Jonathan's ability to tell a story in his compositions, and this one is unique because there's no voice. So a lot of times the voice can take on the actual story in words. And what Jonathan does so beautifully in this piece is just a trio sonata. So we have Baroque violin, Baroque oboe, viola da gamba, and harpsichord. And so throughout the piece, you can clearly hear the story unfolding. And it was so great. And I'll just say one more word about playing historical music versus playing newly composed music is that at the time of whatever piece we were playing historically, the majority of them were newly composed and premieres, or written for a church service and then not played again, or a kind of musicians were handed the music the day of and then they never saw it again. So this attitude of everything is new music, everything is written, audiences aren't coming to the performance knowing what to expect, they haven't listened to a recording of it, they've maybe heard music by the composer or are familiar with the sound world. But that attitude is something that I really cherish and try to bring to old music. But working with a living composer and someone who's commissioning music, it's this same attitude of we're presenting music that has not been heard, and it's up to the composer and the musicians performing it to tell that story with knowing that the audience doesn't have any preconceptions. And so that's what's so exciting for us as historical performers to work with commissions and new composers, is we could really get a window into this world that we're spending so much time trying to get the sense of that. And then here it's just such a nice experience, and it's so yeah, really rewarding to work with the composer, and especially Jonathan. We had such a great time with this piece, and yeah, I'm sure that everyone listening will agree that it's just such a gorgeous piece. So I could go on, but I will stop talking.
Thanks, Shelby. I think it's just a really great point that you make. Maybe sometimes the closest we get to being historical performers are playing is the experience of actually performing and experiencing new works. Right? Sometimes to really engage with maybe a world that we spend all this time researching is actually just to live in the now. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to this clip. I'm going to share my screen again. We're going to listen to the first movement of this wonderful piece written by Jonathan for Cleveland's Les Delys in 2021. Yay! Incredible. It's really, I mean, such beautiful playing, Shelby, and just what an incredible piece, Jonathan. I mean, it really, um, it only makes me more excited to be here tonight. Um, and you know, a piece like this, as Shelby said, has the maybe challenge, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the challenge of being about something but lacking text, right? I mean, it's about the Orpheus myth, so perhaps there's a footnote for recommended reading, but most audiences aren't going to go home and just and do that, right? So with this project, and maybe as you see it relating to other works that you've done, I mean, how do you actually see your process? I mean, what is your starting point when you receive an assignment like this?
So, as you've both said, also, by the way, just want to say, again, Shelby, just your playing and Deborah's and everyone else in that clip just makes me so happy to hear. So thanks for that. I would say that the first thing I do is think about what the story is to be told. So, for example, with that Orpheus piece, which is actually, as Shelby said, it was the first of three movements. The Orpheus myth, for those of you who don't know, I'll try to keep it short. He's given he gives us the gift of music by a visit to the gods on Mount Olympus. Later on, he famously tries to rescue his beloved Eurydice from the underworld, but turns back to look at her too soon, and she's snatched away. And then finally, in some versions of the story, his grief is over her. It's so tiresome to the gods that they tear him apart from limb to limb. And so I took those three aspects of that story and thought about, how can I make music that depicts these things without words? And so you heard the first movement. And when I thought about Orpheus journeying up a mountain to the gods to receive the gift of music in the form of a magic lyre, I thought about the elements of music that we learn about in music theory class, some of those basic things. And I thought, well, could I use some of the basics of music as a metaphorical reference for Orpheus receiving the gift of music? So those of you who are musicologists, as you listen to my piece, you might have heard that the bass line of the movement basically is just a simple scale, just going up and then back down. And that's one of the most simple sort of elements of music. And so I thought, how can I use a musical element to depict a key aspect of the story? So that's exactly the approach I'll take for I Do Promise. And while I have not yet actually started creating the music for I Do Promise, I have been thinking about what exactly is the story that I'd like to tell. And Dominic, I don't know if this was where you wanted to go with this question, but I can talk a little bit about that. Great. So, Dominic discussed in great detail the situation involving the declaration to emancipate Blacks who were willing to fight on the side of the British loyalists. What we also have, there are very few writings from a contemporary period by actual enslaved people. But there is one account by a man named Boston King, who has a great distinction of having been born in South Carolina and experienced enslavement in the South, then did answer this call to join the British loyalist cause, which allowed him to, after fighting in the war, move to New York as a free person, only to, as I think Dominic just alluded to briefly, once the war was completed, one of the terms in the Treaty of Paris was actually for those enslaved Black people who had been freed to be returned to their enslavers in the South, many of whom were living in the North at that point. And so slave catchers did come to the North and returned many of them to the South, although several were able to leave and go to Nova Scotia, as Dominic mentioned, and begin new lives in Canada, and some actually did go back to continental Africa. But this account we have from Boston King, he does eventually escape to Nova Scotia, but so we are able to actually have some really, I think, evocative first-hand accounts of what his experience was like. And I think the direction I'm kind of interested in going right now, the story that I kind of want to tell, is to sort of compare the language in his accounts with some of the language in some of our more well-known American patriots who justified our decision to declare independence from Great Britain in very much the same language that enslaved people used to argue for their humanity and freedom. I think that juxtaposition between white Americans who wanted freedom from Great Britain and Black Americans who wanted freedom from white Americans is very powerful, and it speaks to the difficulty we still have in the United States in 2025 at providing the gift of freedom sort of equally to all our citizens and residents. So that's the direction I'm heading in, and I kind of like to let the story tell me which way to go. My other parameters that I know I have are the instruments that my dear colleagues here will play. That does give me actually a nice sort of envelope to contain sort of my musical ideas. I can't necessarily write something that can't be done on a classical era clarinet or violin. I mean, certainly the instruments, as we get closer to the present day, do sort of have some expansions in their capabilities. I have to kind of think about that as I compose. Even when it comes to the clarinet, which notes can he play, on a certain clarinet versus one that maybe came a few decades later. So these are all factors that I have to kind of think about as I go forward with composing.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating story, and you bringing up Boston King. This is certainly one of our earliest actual accounts of what it was like to be a Black person in America during this period. It's just sort of a story of overlapping contradictions, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up, just because it's such an interesting little tidbit of New York history. I think one of the stories we never hear from the American War for Independence are when people like Boston King were in New York City in 1783, and George Washington was approaching New York City in 1783 with the Continental Army ready to retake the city. He meets with Sir Guy Carleton, who's the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America. They meet in Tappan, New York, and George Washington says, "Okay, the treaty is signed, and we are entitled to have our property back." And Guy Carleton essentially says, "Well, we don't have any of your property." And there's a strange standoff between someone who just won their independence, seeking to enslave or re-enslave a significant population of people who were now seeking refuge in New York, and this British officer who essentially played dumb on behalf of his own sort of humanitarian interests, or what he believed to be true British law at that point. And so it's this picture of George Washington standing on the docks, basically angrily waving his fist. It's not what we associate with the triumphant victory of American freedom and liberty in 1783. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, Jonathan. This idea that some of these texts may in fact juxtapose between traditionally white American narratives around freedom and independence, and then I think what could actually just be called real feelings around freedom and independence. So this, as we've mentioned, this is not your first work tackling this subject matter. In some ways, it might be fair to say this is maybe in essence like a spiritual sequel to In Kings. And I wondered, as you've been thinking of your approach to I Do Promise, if you see that maybe some of the techniques you used in Kings outside of the sort of textual techniques, if there were things that you wanted actually to feel like a through line between these two pieces, or if this really is something that will stand alone.
Well, so I think that there will be some key differences. One being the instrumentation. In Kings, for those listening, was composed for a modern era cello and modern era violin and tenor and alto with no keyboard instrument. So if we were to perform the two pieces back to back, you'd need a slightly larger ensemble than just a sort of smaller chamber group. So I do want the piece to be able, I do promise that is, I do want the piece to be able to stand alone and fit into programming if someone, for example, had another ensemble like ours and just wanted to program a piece like this. That being said, I do think that it will have some spiritual connections, Dom, as you suggested. And like I said, I haven't dived into the writing just yet, but I certainly think there are going to be some ways I can use text in a similar way. In Kings, as I mentioned, it's got an extended bit of text from a runaway slave advertisement, which, of course, texts from the 17th and 18th century, the English that they used is recognizably different from our English today. So I think certainly you'll see some of that in I Do Promise, and perhaps being able to use similar musical techniques to kind of distinguish the older text, and perhaps have a contrast. There certainly will be some musical contrast. I can't tell you exactly what it'll be, but yeah, in Kings will certainly be a blueprint as I go forward. And like you said, this has become almost a specialty of mine, sort of to focus work on particularly our American stories in this country of our history, the good and bad, which it seems like each time I dive into a particular historical subject matter about US history, you find out a lot of disturbing things and you find out a lot of inspiring things. I mean, that's sort of the nature of our country and its history is we have a lot of contradictions. So I think my piece will probably have some. I'll probably try to capture that.
I know we have a Q&A, but I actually have a question for you, Jonathan, already, if I may. So you mentioned In Kings is written for a modern ensemble, meaning modern instruments, I assume A440, all the standard modern aspects. I'm wondering, like, when you compose for historical instruments, how much of your actual writing reverts to inspired by more historical tropes or like writing parameters that might be more suited to the period that the instruments are? Or do you see that your style is just kind of basically what it is and then you apply it to these instruments?
That's a great question, Shelby. And I would say it's more the former. I'm not the only composer, certainly, who's active today who is thinking about historical performers. Thankfully, we're in this great era where there's a lot of really talented historical performers around the country. So lots of composers are writing for them. And when I've heard some of the other works, and I hear techniques that, of course, all of you who've trained on music of many genres in your studies, of course you can execute. But I've always found that, particularly, and I'm actually maybe going to talk about it a little earlier than what we're talking about, which is the Baroque period. I find that those instruments sort of don't sound as good unless they're playing music that sounds like Baroque music. It's just sort of what they were made for. So I always do think about that when I write, specifically for Baroque instruments. This may be the first time that I'm thinking about writing for classical period instruments. So that's going to be an interesting and different challenge. In order to prepare, I'll probably be listening to a lot of music from between 1750 and 1810, just to get a sense of, what those instruments like to do, what they don't like to do. Because I do think everyone's happier, the players, the instruments, and the audience, when the music seems well suited for what it's being played on.
Yeah, it's a great point. And as someone who's played a decent amount of new music, I agree. It is always nicer when the music feels like it fits the instrument. Um, well, thank you, Shelby and Jonathan, for having this conversation. We're not totally winding up yet because I know we do have this Q&A, but I just want to again extend my thanks to the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum and the New York State Council on the Arts for supporting this project, and particularly I want to extend my thanks to my collaborators here, Shelby and Jonathan, for being willing to tackle this project together. It's really the pesky thing about history is that there are these people in it that make it complicated. There are these humans that always sort of get in the way of a good story, or maybe make the story better. But I'm particularly inspired to be working with real live people today who are telling these stories, and committed to bringing this history to audiences, in new and beautiful ways. So thank you both. And
Dominic,
Natalia, oh,
I was just going to thank
Yeah.
you for all your hard work, Dominic, and the research and even this presentation was so impressive and exciting. So I just had to hop in there and say that. So
thanks.
Yeah, thank you again, Jonathan, Shelby, and Dominic, for such a fantastic discussion. To start off the Q&A, we have a few questions. What specific instruments will be included in I Do Promise? What is the average time that it takes to write and finish a composition on a historical instrument compared to a contemporary instrument, for example?
I can answer the first part, then if you want to tackle the second part, Jonathan, is that all right? So we have commissioned this piece for historical clarinet, what we would call a classical clarinet. Something, it basically looks like a clarinet, acts like a clarinet, just has far fewer keys than a modern clarinet. So it looks a lot like a recorder, for instance. So it'll be classical clarinet, and then the sort of historical iterations of violin, viola, and cello. So it actually, and then of course a bass baritone for the vocal part. So in some ways, this actually captures a very common instrumentation and sort of a genre of the period. The clarinet quartet was an extremely popular genre, that proliferated both in Europe and America around the turn of the 18th to 19th centuries. And so it'll be interesting to sort of add this work with voice, to, yeah, an instrumentation that does already have sort of a rich repertoire. And Jonathan, the composy question.
Yeah, about the process. Well, so I'm lucky that I've got a lot of people in my life who play these historical instruments. So I would say the time frame doesn't necessarily vary, comparing between modern and historical. I can always ask a friend about something if I've got a question. I would say my time frame from conception to execution of a finished piece can go anywhere from 6 months to a year. Kind of depends on how busy I am additionally with performing. It can be hard to compose and perform at the same time. So I try to leave myself a little bit of time in my schedule to be at home and write.
Thank you. The second question is, besides the historical documents, what other kinds of inspiration do you take into consideration in drafting pieces like I Do Promise or even the Orpheus piece, besides the mythology? How did you find other historical scores for inspiration?
So my love of this music starts as a young musician, still a student, actually a high school student. I came across Renaissance Polyphony was the first bit of early music that I came across, and just as a performer, I really dedicated my work to it for the first 20 years really of my musical life. And having performed so many works by composers like Bach and Mozart, earlier composers like Monteverdi, uh, I've just sort of absorbed a little bit of the musical languages of the day. So I think that's a big part of the inspiration. Um, as I said, I do try to always start with the subject at hand, but then oftentimes there are things that will inspire me that I didn't expect. Maybe I'll be in a town or a city that has a colonial area. There's lots of them on the East Coast here, and I'm lucky enough that I sometimes get to visit some of the other ones, and sometimes just being physically in a colonial building or in that sort of historical space can give me some inspiration. Something as I that I hear, that I've been listening to, and as I said, I'll probably do a lot of listening to music from the latter half of the 18th century in preparing for this, just to sort of live in that sound world is what we like to say.
And to wrap up the Q&A, this is one of my questions. But I was wondering, how did you all get, and you kind of answered it too, but I was wondering, how did you all get involved in historical performances and instruments? And I'm curious if your involvement in historical performances has changed or altered your own approach to music compared to when you first started training, or if it's taught you something about music that you don't think that you would have learned otherwise if you weren't engaging with this kind of work regularly.
Why don't you guys offer some answers first?
I can start off. That's a great question. And for myself personally, I did not pick up a Baroque or historical violin until I was doing a master's degree in modern performance. And it's a funny story. I actually needed a class to fit my schedule, and I didn't want to have to go to school on a new day. So I picked a class that was like on the Wednesday, and it totally changed my life. It was like the freedom, and I know that might sound like a contradiction because here we are talking about we stick with these parameters and we have to study and research to see what things are like. But actually, there is so much freedom in it because things are not prescribed the way that they are in modern music. And so there's a lot left up to the performer. And historically, it's not that we just have missing information, it's that the way that these pieces, most composers approached writing is that they had an idea of what a player would do with it. And I think what struck me about that class almost immediately is, um, the thought process and the intention behind playing historical music is really rich and really individual. And when you go to early music concerts, even when you play in early music concerts, there's a huge portion that you can't anticipate or that is fresh in the moment. And it's so, I mean, I won't really say there are a lot of exciting things about modern performance and so much value in that, but it's just so um, fulfilling to be a part of something like that, that you put your own individuality, you put your own research into it, your own approach. Um, and that is what I take with me even when I play modern violin, this consideration of what is the intention and how am I going to show that in my own way to the audience that's here. And it's I think one of our most early music performers can agree that the rewarding thing about playing this early music is that we're not modernizing it, we're taking it and living it, where it's like a living history museum. It's like we're living it and we're able to bring that to people. And so that's something that even in modern performance is not always the main priority. Sometimes the main priority you get stuck in perfection or playing it the right way. And with early music, there's kind of no right way. So we get down to these other priorities that are much more exciting for me. So I'll stop there. Dominic, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I love everything that you're saying, and it's I'll just something that I'll just quickly add to that is you know, this prescriptive mentality that sometimes people think exists in early music comes from this idea that we study treatises, right? That we study texts, and that texts tell us what to do or what not to do. But the fun thing about anything that anybody has ever written down is, if you're writing something down, it's very likely that in your own time, someone is believing exactly the opposite of what of what you're writing down. And so in that way, I mean, agreeing with Shelby, one of the things that I think we all find exciting about historical performance is kind of the limitless possibilities of what it means to be a performer making music in the moment, you know, in a live performance. And for me, what actually was my entry point into early music or historical performance was, funnily enough, American Civil War reenacting when I was a high schooler, and finding myself at this Union fortress in Key West, Florida, just sort of sitting on my thumbs with not much to do because I was too young to do any of the fun stuff. And so they kept putting bugles and drums and fifes in my hand, and I was completely useless at all of that. And eventually got connected with an 19th century brass band community that it sort of embraced me and said, you know, start playing 19th century clarinets and you might find yourself in some sort of fun 19th century band circles. And one thing led to another. I was buying a classical clarinet and finding this whole world of music that we kind of have written off. I mean, if there's one thing that actually I'm really grateful for about my point of entry into early music, it is that it wasn't Bach or like Palestrina or, you know, the big ones. I entered via a genre that is widely still overlooked, that was extremely popular in the 19th century. And I think it connects a lot to my current interests in this field, which is investigating the sound world of the late 18th century that, I think is a lot, it was a lot more influential in its own time than it ever is to our audiences. And yeah, I think it's just nice to actually work in a field where, even though theoretically everything we're working on has already happened, there's still so much to uncover and so much to realize and so much to explore. So, Jonathan?
Well, those are two great answers, so I don't have a lot to add. I'll answer, Natalia, the last part of your question, which was what focusing on early music has taught us about existing in the classical music space as a whole. And so for me, that's a great question. I think one of the things I've learned, certainly growing up studying classical music, being a music major in college, you have this sense that the great, with a capital G, the great composers, that is, deserve to be on a pedestal. You know, your Beethovens and Mozart, Bachs and Mahlers. And I think one of the nice things about the historical approach is that we sort of knock the composers off their pedestals, and instead we put the techniques perhaps on a pedestal, the sort of uh, roles that the pieces played in their time, you know, whether it be at this court of this king or at this cathedral at this time. We sort of we pedestalize the historic import rather than the composers themselves. And that's something that I think I enjoy a little bit better. To me, that's easier to connect with as a modern day listener of classical music. Like, oh, this is important because it was connected to this really important institution that shaped our world, as opposed to this one composer was just a genius. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's changed my outlook, certainly.
Of
Thank you
course, the
so much.
composer says that.
Sorry. Thank you so much again. And to everyone watching this talk, if you enjoyed this, please consider making a donation to Dyckman Farmhouse Museum to help us continue offering free public programs like this one all year round. And be sure to follow us on social media to stay updated about our upcoming events and virtual lectures, and to check out the recording of this lecture on our YouTube. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you again, Jonathan, Shelby, and Dominic, for this, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Natalia.